Good morning and welcome into a Friday edition of Duval Rundown here on the 1010XL Jaguars YouTube channel, X, Twitter, the Bird app. Maybe it's going to go back to that now. I don't know. As well as the 1010XL Podcast Network in case you're catching this on demand. I am your host, Mia O'Brien. So excited for today's episode. Our guest here on this Guest Friday is Ben Goessling of the Minnesota, not the Minneapolis, as I found out, the Minnesota Star-Tribune. He, of course, has covered the Vikings for quite some time now, including all 3 years of the Kevin O'Connell administration. And so as we look ahead to what Liam Coen's first season will look like as the head coach of your Jacksonville Jaguars, I've been fascinated not only with speaking with some of our contemporaries, both in Tampa, where Liam Coen came from, in Los Angeles, our friend Jordan Rodrigue, of course, most notably, who cover the Rams. But then I started thinking about other branches of the McVay tree and what we can glean from their success, from their transition, and what we might see from Liam Coen here in Jacksonville. It's a great 30-plus minute discussion with Ben, who was so gracious with his time earlier this week. So yes, unfortunately, it is taped. You can't ask Ben questions live. We could send them to him on Twitter. You could certainly at Ben Goessling on Twitter as well. I'm sure he'd engage in your conversation and your thoughts after this episode, which I think is absolutely tremendous. Some really great insight from Ben that is going to be of much interest to Jaguar fans. Here he is, Ben Goessling on Duval Rundown. 2, 1. A pleasure to be joined here on Duval Rundown by Ben Goessling. He covers the Minnesota Vikings for the Minneapolis Minnesota, almost said Minneapolis. I want to make sure we get that right off the top. Let's make sure we get that correct. Ben Goessling of the Minnesota Star-Tribune. Thanks so much for hopping on Duval Rundown, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me, Mia. I enjoyed the conversation about Grant Udinski a couple of months ago and looking forward to chatting with you today.
Absolutely. You, of course, can check out that interview we had with Ben on the 1010XL Jaguars YouTube channel about Jaguars OC Grant Udinski. But today, it's an interesting topic. We are going to look at Kevin O'Connell, the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, the mentor to one Grant Udinski, his transition from offensive coordinator under Sean McVay to head coach in the National Football League, to some numbers, Ben, that I'm so excited to dive into because he has been one of the ultimate success stories of the Shanahan-McVay tree, and maybe perhaps a glimmer of hope for what Liam Coen could do in Jacksonville. So let's start with this. Mike Zimmer to Kevin O'Connell. Philosophically, take us back to 2021, 2022, and the shift that brought in Minneapolis.
Yeah, it was a massive shift, Mia. I mean, the discussions in the building that happened after Mike Zimmer got fired, the Wilfs, who own the Vikings, the Wilf family had a pretty candid set of conversations with players about what do you want to see in the next regime? Because it wasn't just the coach. It was the coach and the general manager. It was going to be a total reset. It was the biggest one the Wilf family had done in their ownership of the Vikings. And it was very much about what does this thing need to look like to go where we want it to go in the next few years. And players were pretty, as I understand it, pretty unified in saying what they wanted. They wanted a coach that was going to understand them as players, somebody that could relate to them probably a little more effectively than Mike Zimmer could. And that meant somebody younger, but it also meant somebody, I think, with a lot of the mindset that Kevin O'Connell has brought to this job, where he, I think, understands that players have a lot of things going on. Players have their own careers they're considering. They have their own brands that they're building. I think there's a lot of understanding that today's player is a little bit different than the players of probably when Mike Zimmer was in the early part of his career. So there were some things there, but it also was this discussion of, we want somebody that's going to coach us hard, but still relate to us. It doesn't have to be this binary thing of you have to put your arm around somebody or you have to put your foot in their rear end. It can be something that has two sides to it, where you say, I'm going to coach you hard because I care about you. I care about your success. And I want you to understand what we are doing as best as you can, because it helps our team, but it also helps you further your career and achieve your goals as a player. So a lot of that approach that Kevin O'Connell brought to the job, I think, came from Sean McVay. I think it came from a lot of the things that he had learned over the course of his time with Sean in Los Angeles, and probably some things that he learned in other stops as well. But that has been very much kind of the thesis, so to speak, of how he coaches in Minnesota. It's this idea of, I am going to build relationships with players. I'm going to show them how much I care about them as people, but I'm also going to say, there's a standard that needs to be at a certain level, and we need to do everything we can to get there. So it has kind of been this ability to marry both of those things in a way that I don't know was happening quite the same way before.
Here's the thing, though. In retrospect, when you look back at this hire, what was the reaction from certainly the fan base, but even people inside the building, because it was such a stark departure from what the Mike Zimmer regime had looked like?
Yeah, I mean, there were players after Mike Zimmer got fired that came out and said some things in a way that made you realize it was going to look different. I remember Eric Kendricks and Brian O'Neill were both fairly vocal about, we need this to be a more relational type of building. We need a coach that's going to just connect with us a little bit more frequently. And there was some discussion of injuries and how players who were dealing with injuries and coming back from injuries were going to be treated. I think that was a lot of the discussion for the Vikings at the time. And so it was something that players were upset about at the time. They wanted to see some changes there as well. So there was enough of a hint from players, I think publicly, that people realized it was going to look a lot different than it had. So when Kevin O'Connell got hired, I think there was an understanding that it was going to be this type of a coach. And it's very easy to paint with a broad brush of, players coach and that kind of thing and what that may mean. And I think there's certainly elements of that with Kevin O'Connell, but there also was this, I think, realization that he's been on the climb, because that was the point at which the Rams were getting ready to play in the Super Bowl. So he took the job officially, a day after the Rams beat the Bengals in the Super Bowl, and he didn't really get to Minnesota until mid-February. So it made the whole process long enough that everybody got a little bit of a look at Kevin O'Connell from coaching with the Rams and coaching in the NFC title game, coaching in the Super Bowl, doing some interviews during Super Bowl week. All of those things led to a little bit longer introduction period to Kevin O'Connell. But I think a lot of where this hire was going was something players hinted at a little bit, and you saw him kind of fulfill some of that vision they had laid out.
And part of that, of course, Mike Zimmer fired during the 2021 season. Doug Pederson not fired until the day after the 2024 season had concluded. Both Kevin O'Connell and Liam Coen obviously learned at the foot of Sean McVay. Yeah. Both have publicly said they got their PhD in coaching from the Los Angeles Rams. I'm sure you've heard that a time or two. Yeah. This notion of you need to go get the next McVay. You have to pull from that tree. But at the same time, Kevin O'Connell and Liam Coen were not the play caller under Sean McVay. And that I know has been a knock that many have had with Liam Coen, who obviously was only back as the OC after 3 years as an assistant with McVay for one season in 2022, albeit a very trying one, and then spent the 2024 season as a play caller in Tampa. But I'm curious, the idea of maybe there was this unknown of how KOC would be as a play caller. Did that exist back in 2022?
100% it did. I mean, there was this question of how is he going to do in this role, because he was going to be, the Vikings had a run of defensive coaches. So he was going to be the first head coach calling plays. I'm trying to even remember who it would have been, because I don't think Brad Childress did it either. I think it was Darrell Bevel calling plays for those teams. So it was going on 20 years since the Vikings had a coach calling plays offensively while being the head coach. So, I mean, you'd had Leslie Frazier on the defensive side. You had Mike Zimmer on the defensive side. So this was going to be a fairly large change. And there was a big question about how he was going to do with it. He inherited, of course, Kirk Cousins, which gave him a veteran quarterback that he had worked with a little bit in Washington in the past. So that might have made things a little smoother. But Kevin O'Connell never shied away from the idea that he could do it and do it at a fairly high level. I mean, he talked quite a bit about some of the work Sean McVay gave him in the preseason. He said that was awfully important for me as a play caller to get a chance in a couple of preseason games to call things, to see what I like to do, and then to be able to go back to Sean afterwards and discuss, how did this go? What were you thinking here? What worked here? What did not? I mean, those things are different, obviously, than a regular season game where there's pressure and there's higher stakes and those kinds of things. But what are we going to call on 3rd and 3 if we get this look is not terribly different than what you're going to see in week 8 of a regular season, for example. So I think those things were very important for Kevin O'Connell. He's talked quite a bit about it, and he's given Wes Phillips, his offensive coordinator in Minnesota, some of those same opportunities. And every time he does that, he says, Sean McVay doing this for me was so instrumental in my career. I want to pay this forward. So I think those things helped. And it was a lot of it was Sean McVay had his door open quite a bit. I think Kevin O'Connell has said that the time Sean McVay invested in him in terms of, let's help you get ready so that when you get your chance, I want you to understand how to do it and thrive, was something that Sean McVay was very open about. And I've seen coaches kind of go about this different ways. You'll see some coaches that say, no, I'm not doing that because I don't want my coaches to leave. I don't want brain drain to affect my staff. But Sean McVay has been very much, I think, of a different mindset where it's, if I develop you and you go somewhere else and we get a tree, that's great because it says to the next coaches, this is a place I can come in and work and better myself and get developed and go to the next level. So that message, I think, has been one that you've heard Kevin O'Connell talk about too, where now that Grant Udinski goes from assistant QB coach to offensive coordinator, it does send this message that Minnesota is a place where I can go and learn and develop. And this is a place for me to be. And then, you get coaches probably as a result of that are upwardly mobile, coaches that are ambitious, coaches that have high goals and high intentions to do everything they need to do. And if you only have them for a few years, that's a setback, I suppose. But if you get the best out of them while they're there, it can be a good thing in the long run for the organization as well.
That conversation just prompted another note in my brain. So I'm going to call an audible here. Daniel Jeremiah on Move the Sticks had Ken Coleman, longtime leadership consultant, coach, podcaster, on his podcast earlier this week. And they discussed this idea of talented play caller ascends to the head coaching role. And obviously they're going to continue to call plays, even though some people may say you need to be focused on being a CEO, not a play caller. And Ken argued that if that is where they are at their best, you can delegate other head coaching responsibilities. What have you seen KOC say, hey, I do want to be focused on the play calling. I do want to be focused on investing in my offensive players. So I'm going to delegate other administrative or team building responsibilities to someone else.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's something that he has done in a number of different ways. Actually, Grant Udinski was hired to be part of that solution. He was hired as an admin guy. And I don't think that Kevin O'Connell, in his diplomatic way, would say that that was the best part of Grant's ability level. I mean, there are some stories about those two, and I wrote about one of them where when Grant Udinski was in that kind of chief of staff type role, he goes on these backpacking trips. And we talked about this, I think, the last time we had a conversation. But he would go on these trips, and the first one he did in this role was going to the Rocky Mountains. And O'Connell still needed to get a hold of him about training camp schedules or something, some detail of, hey, when we get back to work, we need to have this ready to go. Here's what I'm thinking for, day one install kind of stuff. He tries to get a hold of him and he can't get a hold of Grant Udinski for a few days. So now he starts to wonder about, are you off the grid or did something happen to you? Do I need to worry about your safety and all of these things? When Grant Udinski gets back to cell phone coverage, it was 30 text messages of, hey, coach is looking for you. Call him as soon as you can. He wants to make sure you're okay and all of these things. And it's become a running joke over the years. But I think they realized that there were probably better fits for Grant Udinski maybe than that role, both because of perhaps his skill set and some things that maybe he wasn't quite as aptly suited to do. But whether it's been him, and they just hired Henry Schneider to replace Grant Udinski in some of those roles, to be a little more of the admin person. He's had that. And then the other thing he did when he got hired was bring in Mike Pettin, who had hired him in his first job as a quarterbacks coach in Cleveland. He'd been with O'Connell had been with Mike Pettin, I should say, as a backup quarterback when Mike Pettin was with the Jets. So they had a relationship, and Mike Pettin was, coming towards the end of his career, had been a head coach, didn't have a lot of interest in kind of getting back into that world, but he could run things if Kevin O'Connell needed to go and just lock himself in a room and be able to watch film. There were some things that Mike Pettin understood in terms of how to speak to a team, how to speak to a coaching staff, how to, organize a week so that Kevin O'Connell didn't have to do all of those things all at the same time. And that was something that I think O'Connell knew he needed. I think it's something that Sean McVay probably impressed upon him, that you need this. And it was something Mike Pettin understood that Kevin O'Connell needed. He basically came in and said, I am willing to play this role because it frees you up to do the football things that you need to still be able to do, even though you have to have a hand in marketing. You have to have a hand in, relating to other departments in the building. You have to do a lot more media. You have to have a lot more of a public face in all of these ways. If players are having contract negotiations or contract squabbles, sometimes you have to get involved in those things. I mean, all of that goes into a head coach's job, but he still has to be Sunday, or he's not going to have the job to do the other things. So I think Mike Pettine understood that and has been kind of an instrumental piece of this for Kevin O'Connell. So as Liam Coen goes through this too, I'm curious to see if he will build a similar structure, because it is a job, as you know, that pulls you in 10 different directions all the time, and being able to do it and kind of keep your sanity, I think, is a battle in and of itself.
And that's what I think is really interesting, Ben, because you could argue that that's part of why Tony Boselli has ascended to this executive vice president role.
Yeah.
Not just to take some of the load off of James Gladstone, the general manager, but to also take some of the load off of Liam Coen, so that truly he will handle the ancillary equipment, flight schedules, coordination, that operations, those sort of things. Tony will be overseeing. And the GM can focus on personnel acquisition, and the head coach can focus on what happens on the grass. And it's something that in Jacksonville, for lack of a better term, quite frankly, and I've heard this from enough people in the building, they didn't know who was overseeing that at times. And at times it was Trent Baalke, and that may have rubbed Doug Pederson the wrong way. Yeah. One more before we actually get into the offensive scheme of Kevin O'Connell. Kwesi Adefo-Mensah obviously earns a well-deserved contract extension last week, but he and Kevin O'Connell were a package deal. And that is something that we haven't seen in Jacksonville until this past winter, since Dave Caldwell and Gus Bradley were hired in 2013, 12 years ago. That clean, sweeping change. How much has it been a benefit to KOC, the fact that he and Kwesi came in together?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of their initial bonding was, and they'd worked together just briefly in San Francisco when both of them were, when Kevin was on the coaching staff and Kwesi was in the front office. But they have, I think, found a way to connect. And people still talk about the first interview that Kevin O'Connell had with the Vikings search committee once Kwesi was installed as the GM, and they did this out in Los Angeles, I think right after the NFC Championship game, if I remember correctly, when the Rams won that. And there was a pretty clear indication quickly that the two of them saw things the same way. They're basically the same age. They're a couple of years apart. They both grew up kind of in the Philly area, at least briefly. Kevin O'Connell bounced around a lot. His dad was in the FBI, but they lived in that New Jersey part of Philly, of the Philly suburbs, for quite a bit of their youth. And so there's some cultural kind of shared history there. I think they have the ability to relate to each other on that level as friends, but it has, I think, been important for the two of them to come at it from different angles and understand which one brings a certain skill set to the table. Kevin O'Connell is not the analytics guy. He understands analytics, but he's also a football guy, and he's not making all of his decisions based on spreadsheets, whereas Kwesi Adefo-Mensah has come from that background and has acknowledged the fact that I'm not necessarily the quote-unquote football guy. I didn't come up as a scout for 20 years. I didn't grow up, poring over film of guards to see what their technique is like on a pass set versus another guy. I mean, that's not the world he came from. So he's learned, I think Kevin O'Connell has learned more of the cap, more of the analytics stuff that is sort of animating what the front office wants to do at this point. So they have kind of found a middle ground here, I think, in a lot of ways, saying, what do I bring to the table? What do you bring to the table? And how can we kind of enhance each other? And one of the things I think that has helped them is when Kevin O'Connell says, this is what I want, or I think even when Brian Flores says, this is what I want on defense, this front office has been pretty good about saying, okay, let's go get those things. Let's understand what the coaches need to make these schemes work, what kind of players they need to make the schemes work, and then let's go figure out the rest of it. So I think there's been, especially in free agency, because the draft results have not been terribly successful yet, but in free agency, they have hit a lot of home runs last year. And I think a lot of that conversation has driven their ability to find specific fits for what they're trying to do on the field while the front office helps the coaching staff make that work.
A couple more as far as on the field. I promised our listeners, off the top of this, that we would have some great stats. And for me, this is a stat we've talked about on Helmets and Heels, the 1010XL kickoff show before Jaguars games. I am fascinated by Kevin O'Connell's second best winning percentage among active coaches in one possession games. Because as we all know, In year one, 2022, the Vikings go 13-4, 11-1, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
in one possession games. And everyone says, well, the ball's bouncing their way. It's not going to carry over. And yet here he is, 25-9 in 3 seasons in one possession games. That's a 73.5% win percentage. It is crazy.
Yeah.
And at some point in time, I think, Ben, we have to accept that it is not just the ball bouncing their way. Why has he been able to create a ecosystem that thrives in those high pressure situations?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one I've spent a lot of time pondering, because you do sit there and look at it and say, this is not sustainable. How much of close games, and this is a lot of the discussion, is how much of close games, winning close games is luck. How much of it is if we get a bounce a certain way versus we have a skill to be able to do this. And I think when he's done it at the level he has, it does become a little more difficult to say this is just a fluky thing. I think he has been able to, in a couple of ways, make this whole thing work. They spend a lot of time talking about situational football with players. The phrase you'll hear him use is one he got, I believe, from Sean McVay, situational masters.
Oh, we hear that with Liam too already.
Yep,
there
I'm
it
gonna
is.
Say you're going to hear that a lot down there. This is something that is definitely from that Sean McVay lineage, but they spend a lot of time. I mean, Ryan Cordell is on their staff. He basically is their sort of game strategy coordinator. He's up in the booth, providing data in real time of, hey, if you think about going for it, if they're facing a 3rd and 3, all right, if you're going to call this and you don't get it, here's the situation in terms of what the data would say you should do on 4th down, so you can start thinking about those things. Here's what the range looks like for a field goal if you're thinking about that. So they've built some things into the operation so they can work really quickly and have a good decision-making process when it's coming down to it. You maybe have 12 seconds to figure out, do we want to kick? Do we want to go for it? What do we want to run here? I mean, all of those things that help you execute in those moments, they have done everything they can to set up an apparatus that works for them. But I think a lot of it, too, comes down to players. And they spend a lot of time drilling these things with players. They spend a lot of time talking about getting players in the mindset where the stress of the moment is not going to limit their ability to make an effective decision and execute properly. So I think a lot of it comes down to the way they preach culture in these situations. You'll see Kevin O'Connell quite a bit be very aggressive on 4th downs, almost to the point where you're saying, I guess the situations I think of are the ones where they've had a lead and he's still throwing, and the game is still hanging in the balance, and it's, why don't you just run the ball and salt the clock away? And some of it has been their personnel, but he's also talked about, I want my quarterback to know that I have enough belief in him that I think he can make every throw on the field. And some of the play calls he's making, I think, are almost to send a message to the quarterback as much as they are about that particular game and that particular moment. So I think he believes that the balance of those things leads to a more confident player, a more confident quarterback that ultimately is probably the most important component of winning those types of games. So that investment in that player, I think he filters a lot of what he does in close games through that. I would not be surprised if Liam Coen takes the same approach with Trevor Lawrence. I think that is something that is pretty fundamental to the way these guys think about play calling in close games and how it can be seen as an endorsement or almost a referendum, I guess, on the quarterback. If you say, I'm going to keep pushing the ball here, it can be a way to tell your quarterback, hey, man, I believe you can do it, and I'm going to put my money where my mouth is.
And to that point, that relationship between KOC and the quarterback, the viral clip, the mic'd up of him talking into Sam Darnold's green dot, into his headset, into the helmet, and preaching positivity. It's what we talked about at the top, that there was a need for that in Minnesota, certainly perhaps a need for that for Trevor Lawrence and some of the players who need confidence instilled in them here in Jacksonville. But did you find KOC had a similar conversation, rapport with Kirk, with certainly Josh Dobbs and some of the other quarterbacks that have been rolled through in the last 3 years?
Yeah, very much so. I think it has taken a little different flavor with each one of those players just because of who they were. I think with Kirk, if you go back and watch quarterback, there's an episode, the episode where they're coming back against the Colts and they're down 33-0. And there's a couple of throws where Jalen Reagor runs the wrong route and Kirk throws a pick, and you see him on the sideline because Kirk was very, very critical of himself, almost to the point where he'd kind of go into this hole if something went badly in a game. And you see O'Connell kneeling down on the sideline next to him saying, there's nothing you can do about that. Don't let this affect your next throw. And there's, I think, a second time it happens. O'Connell says, no, don't get frustrated here. And you hear Cousins go, oh, I'm getting frustrated. He's basically saying this particular player hears things a certain way and perceives things a certain way. So I need to coach him in a way that doesn't lead him off the edge. I don't want to feed into the things that he does that may be shortcomings for him. I think a lot of it was there. Josh Dobbs, that first game, I remember, a lot of people probably remember this game where Josh Dobbs basically got traded for on a Tuesday at the trade deadline after Kirk got hurt, ends up playing that Sunday when Jaron Hall gets a concussion and comes in and helps them win the game. O'Connell essentially was going no huddle so that he could tell Josh Dobbs as much as he could before the headset cut out. It was, here's the play call. If you get this, can to this. If you're going here, your first read on this type of coverage is over here, and then you can progress to the backside. I mean, he was basically trying to give him as much as he could. I use the example in my story. It was almost like, I haven't seen the latest Mission Impossible yet, but typically when Tom Cruise is running through, he's got, I think it's Simon Pegg plays the character Benji saying, hey, I'm going to open up this auxiliary door here, and you need to go through this tunnel shaft and get down to this, area that you're not supposed to be in because the alarms are going to go off if you go this other way. Kevin O'Connell was doing that as best as he could for Josh Dobbs in that situation. So some of it, I think, in that situation was unique to that game, but it's been a lot of those things. He did a little bit of that with Sam Darnold last year, but a lot of it with Darnold, I think, was just trying to flood the zone with as much optimism as he could, knowing that Sam Darnold's career and the narrative around Sam Darnold had gone so far another way. So I wonder with Trevor Lawrence, it's not to that degree that Sam Darnold had to fight back from, but I wonder how much of that will be part of Liam Coen, Grant Udinski's approach with Trevor Lawrence there. I would imagine Grant Udinski is going to take a lot of the cues of things he's learned and talked about with Kevin O'Connell into how he goes about his job in Jacksonville. And what you've seen is, I think, an approach that begins with, what does this particular quarterback need from me? And how do I mold my approach to that player based around those things?
And that's where I kind of want to wrap on the KOC conversation. This idea, and it's been really interesting because I'm actually reading Mike Silver's The Why is Everything right now. Yeah. And it's so interesting to read about Kyle Shanahan and the stubborn nature, and even Sean McVay, and to his credit, because he's been open about it. And certainly Jordan Rodriguez's story this past week in The Athletic reflects that as well. His relationship with Jared Goff, in which it was similar to what you described with KOC with Josh Dobbs on 4 days' notice, literally telling Goff where to go, perhaps to his detriment and his growth. But point being that both McVay and Shanahan grew frustrated with their quarterbacks if they weren't executing exactly how they asked them to do. And that's where I feel like KOC almost is a departure from that, because he's okay when things go awry, and he's okay with adapting his offense to whoever that quarterback is, or at least that's my perception on having, 3 to 4 quarterbacks in a 3-year period. It's been impressive to watch. And I go back to what Liam Coen has said, and I'm sure you've heard KOC say it too, this notion of players over plays.
Yeah.
I feel like in a weird twist of fate, then the student in KOC has done a better job, and even Liam Coen in Tampa last year, the student has done a better job of adapting to the quarterback's skills than even the teacher in McVay or Shanahan did in their first few years as a head coach.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there has been an ability to learn, an ability to kind of say, okay, this is what I've seen. Now, how am I going to do this if I get my chance to be the head coach going forward? I even think of Matt LaFleur coming out of the Sean McVay world, and you go in, and you're right. A lot of these coaches have talked about, kind of wanting these types of quarterbacks that this is the way the play is supposed to go. And you hear a lot of these guys talk about there are answers in the play. The play has answers. That's why a lot of them like Kirk Cousins so much, because Kirk Cousins is pretty set on, I'm going to play the position the way my coach wants me to do it. And you can kind of steer him in a certain direction because of the way that you talk about the system, and he's going to execute it probably pretty closely to that template. So you go from guys that prefer quarterbacks like that in some cases to Matt LaFleur going to Green Bay and saying, okay, I have a former MVP quarterback who's done this at as high a level as anybody in the NFL and knows it. It regards himself in that type of way. So how do you make it work with a guy like Aaron Rodgers, who's had all of this freedom to can things at the line and basically do what he wants for those first few years? Well, Matt LaFleur goes to, I think, 2 or 3 NFC title games, and they didn't win those with Aaron Rodgers, but the level of success that he had early on, I'm sure had to be a lot about adapting to what he's dealing with in the moment. Kevin O'Connell, you've seen it too, whether it's been Kirk Cousins, the parade of quarterbacks they had that second year because of the injuries, and then Sam Darnold. I mean, they still have had, I believe, Jaron Hall is the only quarterback they drafted, and he's no longer in the organization. He's a 5th-round pick. He's the only quarterback they've drafted that has thrown a pass in a regular season game for Kevin O'Connell, because J.J. McCarthy has not done it yet. So he's done all of this basically saying, I'm working with whatever quarterback I have here at the time. I'm not doing it with my hand-picked person to play this position. So I think some of it has, you're right, been him understanding, how do I have to adapt? How do I have to work with what's in front of me and, make the best of it to try to win with what I have now. So you've seen the offense change, I think, as a result. Sam Darnold's arm strength on some of those backside dagger cuts they ran a lot last year. There were different flavors to it than what you saw with Kirk Cousins. And I expect that'll change with J.J. McCarthy too. I think there's a willingness to understand the people that you have and the ingredients you have to make the recipe right now probably have to dictate what you do as much as, what you might want to do if you're designing a team in a lab.
And that's why we spent all of last Friday's Duval Rundown episode, which if you want to go back and listen to that on demand, folks, you certainly can, with Evan Klosky of 10 Tampa Bay, analyzing what Liam Coen's offense looked like in Tampa, but recognizing, Ben, it's probably not going to look exactly like that in Jacksonville. And of course, we dispel this notion every Wednesday with Hayes Carlyon on Duval Rundown, this idea of Doug Pederson openly admitting last year that he was running the same exact offensive system that he ran in Philadelphia in 2017, 7 to 8 years prior.
Yeah.
And this idea of the McVay and the Shanahan tree, they say, no, every year we got to evolve. We got to adapt. We've got to change. And that's not to say that Doug and Press Taylor didn't change some things.
Yeah.
But there needs to be curtailing and wholesale changes depending on who the ingredients are in this jumbo stew of an offense, if you may.
Yeah, no doubt. And the other thing is the league is going to catch up to what you're doing. I mean, defensive coordinators are studying everything that you're doing to try to figure out how to stop it. I mean, you've seen all of this change with the Vic Fangio type schemes, probably as a result of all of the motion and all of the ways that the McVay Shanahan trees could impact what a coverage shell is doing based on, if it was cover 3 and you have one safety in the middle, it's not evenly split. I think a lot of that too deep stuff is the same on either side in terms of the shell. So we're not going to be bothered by the motion quite as much. And then you see offenses say, fine, if you're going to keep people deep, we're going to run the ball a little bit more. That's going to come back because we're going to take advantage of the light boxes that Brandon Staley always used under Sean McVay. So there is this constant cat and mouse game that everybody talks about. The chess match is a real thing. This is the time of year where defensive coordinators are sitting down saying, okay, we got this all of these times last year. Teams killed us with it. How are we going to have an answer for it so that if they do it again, we can take it away, and they don't know how to adjust to that. So that is constantly happening. And I think if you are sitting there saying, let's just run back the same stuff all the time, you're going to have a really hard time keeping your head afloat in the NFL. So that adaptation, I think, is a constant reality of this job.
Before we let you go, Ben, because you've been very gracious with your time, I do want to sneak in a quick question. Obviously, like we alluded to, you came on Helmets and Heels. We talked about Grant Udinski. That's available on demand. But Shaun Sarrett had not been hired as the offensive line coach in Jacksonville when we last spoke on air. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that hire. Did he and Grant have rapport that perhaps said, hey, maybe he's the guy who's going to end up in Jacksonville as Liam Coen's first offensive line coach?
Yeah, I mean, they had obviously worked together here in Minnesota, and I think Grant Udinski had a pretty high opinion of Shaun Sarrett. He's not somebody that Kevin O'Connell was terribly excited to lose. I know that. I mean, they had a lot of young coaches on this staff that they're kind of figuring are going to move up into bigger roles going forward. And Chris Cooper, the head offensive line coach, is somebody that Kevin O'Connell thinks very highly of and has been given opportunities to remake this line in a lot of different ways, including this year, which is going to have a different appearance for the Vikings. But yes, I think Grant Udinski had a pretty high opinion of a lot of the coaches on this staff. And there's always that question of how many of them can I take with me? And, what's the rules of engagement, so to speak, on doing that? And how many times does the coach block people? And Kevin O'Connell, I think for the most part, has been fairly willing to let people move for bigger opportunities and hasn't stood in the way of that. I've seen that happen. I certainly saw that happen with Mike Zimmer and Kevin Stefanski a couple of times when Kevin Stefanski had a chance to move up to a role outside of Minnesota, and then ultimately he did. But there were a couple of times that happened before he even got the Browns job. So there are different approaches to this, and different coaches play it different ways. But yes, I think in that particular case, it was two guys that had a lot of chances to work together and had discovered they have some similar philosophies and can probably have a larger role together going forward. Obviously, offensive line coaches have such a major role in designing run games and figuring out how all of those things get mapped out. So I'm sure the two of them working together on those things is something that they had talked about and something that Grant Udinski was pretty excited about doing.
And Sarrett obviously was the assistant in Minnesota comparatively to when he was the head O-line coach in Pittsburgh. I'm just curious, did you guys have any sort of interaction with him as far as what Jaguar fans can expect?
Not a lot. I mean, I think the idea that Grant Udinski is probably a unique one in terms of the assistant position coach that you get to kind of sit down and talk with as much as I did in that particular case, but not a ton. I know players liked him and players respected a lot of the work he did. I think part of what you saw with Kevin O'Connell too is there was this approach of, I want a big coaching staff because I want players to get individualized instruction quite a bit. And I think those assistant coaches, those assistant position coaches play an important role in that thought process because he basically is trying to get the student to teacher ratio as low as he possibly can get it. So coaches like that in those types of positions that may not be celebrated as much or viewed as highly play awfully important roles in the way that Kevin O'Connell thinks about things. And I think Sean McVay is very similar in that regard. So those types of coaches get their opportunity to make their presence felt, kind of build that rapport with players, and it only serves them well going forward, I think.
And that's very interesting because there's two assistant offensive line coaches or assistant offensive assistants here in Jacksonville now, Ben. And that has allowed for three coaches as opposed to one and an assistant kind of last year. It was not exactly the, hey, we've got three coaches who are dedicated to one position group, and that allows for that more personalized attention. I told you that
very familiar.
That is the whole reason we have had you on Duval Rundown here today, Ben, to look if there was anything from the Kevin O'Connell transition to Minnesota that perhaps we could see recreated here in Jacksonville. I told you I'd keep you 15 to 20 minutes. It's been over 35. This has been a tremendous conversation. If you want to plug before we let you go, anything that you have in the works at the Minnesota Star-Tribune, as well as final thoughts about what I'm going to dub the From KOC to LIM, in the words of From Justin to Kelly episode of Duval Rundown.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing I would plug is we had Kwesi Adofo-Mensah on our Access Vikings podcast this week and had a great conversation with him. So people can check that out wherever you get your podcasts. Access Vikings is the name of the show. So it was fun to get a chance to chat with him about kind of what the off seasons looked like. He just got his new contract and kind of what they're expecting from JJ McCarthy. So there may be some things in terms of the fit and the general blueprint of what the Vikings do. If Jaguars fans are curious about that and how it may map over, that'd be worth checking out there as well. And that one's coming out. And then our Access Vikings newsletter, which I'm the author of, comes out every Friday as well. So there's always, if you're interested, to whatever extent you're interested in Viking stuff, those are great places to go. So those would be things you can find on my socials and certainly would eagerly point people toward those things.
Awesome. Ben Goessling, thank you so much for hopping on Duval Rundown. This has been tremendous. Best of luck this fall covering the Vikings.
I enjoyed it. Thanks so much again for having me, Mia.
There we go. There we go. Technological issues there, friends. How we doing? Thanks so much again to Ben Goessling for joining us here on Duval Rundown on this fine Friday morning, and appreciate the over 500 of you who watched this one live. Of course, tell your friends it will be available on demand. I put in the comments that if you had any questions about what Ben had to say, that we would address some of them. Only question I really saw was from Brian, who said that I thought that Tony Khan was supposed to be the guy doing that. And what that was in reference to was this idea of some of the I don't want to say ancillary, but the additional responsibilities of a head coach that maybe we don't talk about as much in the National Football League. And sometimes those responsibilities, as they have at times here in Jacksonville, actually fall to the general manager. Things like administrative work, equipment, operations, logistics. What hotel are we staying at? Well, yes, you have people who are in charge of those departments. Who oversees those departments? I can tell you this in Jacksonville, who has overseen those departments has shifted at times over the last 5 years. And that is why Tony Boselli has taken over the role of executive vice president. All of those roles that Ben was alluding to, that Kevin O'Connell said, okay, if I'm going to be the primary play caller, then some of these other duties I am going to have to delegate to someone else, whether that be his now former chief of staff, Grant Udinski, Mike Pettin coming in, and certainly being that, hey, I'll step in and oversee practice while you're in the lab cooking up plays. Many of those roles, not necessarily in that order here in Jacksonville, but many of those other responsibilities, Tony Boselli is taking that load from Liam Coen, from James Gladstone, and allowing Liam Coen to focus on coaching, building his staff, designing the offense, and for James Gladstone to focus on player personnel. But what a great conversation with Ben Goessling. Again, make sure you go follow him, the Minnesota Star-Tribune. We learn something new every Friday here on Duval Rundown. I know I'm going to be sure to check out his conversation with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. That one is always so fun to say. Speaking of technology being fun and then pronouncing words like that. We really appreciate Ben's time. It was a great conversation. Be sure to like and subscribe here to the 1010XL Jaguars YouTube channel if you're watching us live on YouTube. If you're watching us live on X, be sure to flip on over to YouTube and make sure you do like and subscribe. We had the opportunity to sit down with a variety of assistant coaches from the Jacksonville Jaguars 2025 staff, multiple coaches. Those interviews will be posted throughout the day here today on this Friday, June 6th. That includes my conversation with Shaun Sarrett, the offensive line coach, who you heard Ben also referenced because of his time in Minnesota. I thought it was very interesting, not only as he described how his coaching staff within that room is going to work, so you'll want to go check that out. He also had some pretty pointed descriptions of some of the incumbents in the Jaguars offensive line room. You know, you're going to want to go check that out. This has been Duval Rundown on 1010XL. Be sure again to like and subscribe here on YouTube, and to also make sure that you tell your friends to check us out on demand wherever you get your podcasts. Have a great weekend, everybody. We will be back on Monday with my friend Frank Frangie.